well, we both know the U.S. is facing its worst economic depression since the Great Depression in the 1920s. With banks floating out money to non-qualified borrowers, the housing market crashed. But unlike that Great Depression, the government right now is in a $4 trillion debt that continues to grow every single day. The American public is suffering from layoffs, low wages, and they both contribute to the citizens' rising debt. One solution to address these issues would be to maintain the privatization of our banks. And privatizing banks means giving complete ownership and control of the banks to private businesses and companies without any government intervention.
I mean, I don't think that keeping banks the way they are now is going to do anything to solve this financial crisis. I mean, when a financial crisis is threatening our economy, we really only have two options. We can either bail out the financial capitalists in some way, or we're just going to have to suffer a more severe financial crisis, which in turn is just going to lead to even more misery and hardships. I think the only way to avoid this dilemma is to make an economy that's less dependent on the financial capitalists. And the only way we're going to do that is to give government full control of the banks so that they're going to be the main provider of credit, especially for home mortgages, loans, and maybe even business loans. So, in other words, we need to nationalize finance.
How would nationalizing banks help solve this economic crisis?
I mean, it's not reasonable to think that just one thing is going to solve the entire crisis completely, but if we nationalize banks, it's definitely going to stabilize the banking system, and it's going to lead to an increased lending of credit-worthy businesses and consumers.
Well, that sounds like it could work. I mean, one main contributor of the recession were banks lending out money, and allowing banks to give out more money would only hurt the economy, putting it further into our debt.
I mean, the lending you're talking about was part of all those risky loans that we're giving out, which, was the cause of this crisis, essentially, when you had these companies who were just looking to make a profit, and they were giving loans to anyone without checking their credits, their assets, their job histories. I mean, the goal of these banks that are nationalized isn't going to be to pursue a profit. It's going to be for important public policy.
Well, wouldn't there be corruption and the risk that government would interfere in the lending decisions that were occurring? I mean, in government businesses, decisions are always made for personal gain, and history shows us that government employees are corrupt and they'll take bribes when needed to make political gains. I mean, with privatization, less corruption would occur, if any, and then it wouldn't hurt our performance or our economy if it did.
I mean, the point you bring up is valid, but that situation can easily be avoided because, say, these nationalized banks start becoming corrupt. It's pretty, a simple process to make them privatized again.
Why not just cut out the middleman and start by keeping the privatization of banks? I mean, it'll save time and money and restore the economy quicker.
I mean, the situation can't just be cured in one small, swift action. We need to take big, extreme actions to fix the situation we're in now. And, these steps, I think, can only be taken by nationalization. So it's going to give the federal government the power to negotiate, and if necessary, they'll be able to force a workable solution for all the important players.
Well, I mean, talking about these important players, wouldn't someone need to bear the pain of this bank restructuring? Who would that be? It would be the taxpayers and the common shareholders. It seems that what you're talking about would just be really expensive for the public. It would cost them millions.
Everyone's saying how nationalizing banks is going to be so expensive and everything, but I think that controversy can easily be ignored. I mean, the government is going to be spending a ton of money with or without nationalizations. And in an ideal scenario, actually, once the banks, recover their credit, the taxpayers are going to come out ahead in the long run.
All right, well, with privatizing banks and giving all the control to the private sectors, it would ensure increased efficiency and performance for the banks. That would work harder to create a better customer service, and the private sector is the one held accountable for the money, and they can reinvest that money into other profitable areas.
I mean, you have to consider that the owners of these privatized banks could be greedy, and perhaps they're only in the business for themselves or to make personal gains. I mean, they wouldn't be looking out for the best interest of the country or the economy. But if you have banks that are nationalized, it's going to give people of all places an equal opportunity and chance for business.
But with privatization, the private sector is the one who needs to appeal to the entire population in order to get business. when you say like owners would be greedy, and that would just force consumers away, the opposite of what privatization is trying to achieve. I mean, privatizing banks means that there's going to be a sense of customer support and satisfaction that would be like there, and that would encourage transactions with the general public to increase productivity, stimulate the economy, and allow people to spend more money.
I mean, I'm still not convinced that this whole keeping banks privatized is the best solution. If we privatize banks, I mean, what's going to happen if these banks fall through? There's no backbone, there's no one accountable if all this money is lost within those banks. I mean, what's going to happen to all the customers?
Only businesses and enterprises worthy and intelligent enough would be in control of these privatized banks. For a group of people to manage their own bank, a great deal of organization, time management, and skill would be required. And those people would be intelligent enough to implement a system to avoid bankruptcy and protect the consumers.
I mean, with the nationalization of banks, you don't even have to worry about that because the government is responsible for all the money. For example, in Sweden in the early 1990s, there's a similar financial crisis where the credit bubble burst and there's a widespread credit crunch. And the government decided to institute reforms and nationalize the banks there. So the government took full control and ownership and responsibility of all the debt and protected shareholders, bondholders, and investors. And with doing this, they were able to keep the banks afloat, and in time, the taxpayers were getting returns on their money, like I mentioned before. And just to prove my point even more, Nordbanken, which was one of these banks that had become nationalized in Sweden, is now one of the biggest banks in the Baltic Sea region.
The only difference between us and Sweden at that time is Sweden wasn't facing the immense of an economic crisis that we are today, and they weren't in the midst of this trillion dollar of debt. You know, I mean, is it even viable to consider Sweden's reforms as a solution to the crisis that we're facing right now?
I mean, there are economic analysts all over that are saying that we need to look at Sweden to take notes on how to solve this financial crisis.
Well, I mean, the same steps just can't be taken as they did in Sweden. I mean, it's a different time, and we're facing completely different circumstances. How do you propose? What do you propose are the exact steps to be taken for the U.S. to nationalize it? Really?
All right. Well, first of all, what needs to happen is that the government intervention of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that's already occurred needs to be made permanent. So these government mortgage agencies should be able to achieve the public policy goals of decent housing for all rather than profit maximization. And secondly, major banks that are labeled as too big to fail need to be nationalized and operated to achieve these similar public policy objectives. And the nationalization is going to involve a significant write-down of the existing debt of these large companies like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And the nationalized banks, in order to make these financial institutions solvent again without costing taxpayers anything.
Well, I mean, if this plan is implemented as you propose, I'm interested in seeing if it can actually be achieved, how it is implemented, and if it can actually bring us out of this economic crisis.